Beijing's working on cutting the poverty rate for some time now, and that was the main focus of my conversation with Sanjay Reddy, an associate economics professor for the New School for Social Research, and I asked whether there's been any change in attitudes towards poverty.
Well, I have long recognized, as has everyone else, I think, who's followed this, that China is the most remarkable story of poverty reduction in world history. In a very short period of time, reducing poverty enormously and really taking the world with it. If we ask the question, why were the Millennium Development Goals at least partially achieved, and the first one is about poverty reduction, the answer has everything to do with China. But if we look outside of China, I think the situation is much more muddy, and that is recognized by many people. In Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, you have success stories and you have ones that are not so successful. And so it's a much more mixed picture.
Yeah. That said, Professor, there are still serious challenges in China to overcome, right? I mean, getting out of poverty is one thing. How about staying out of poverty? And in this new 5-year plan, I'm sure some of these issues will be addressed significantly. What would you like to see addressed in the 5-year plan?
Well, that's a great question. So many people for years now have been talking about the need for China to rebalance its economy, to move more toward consumption. But if we ask what that really means, it's not only a question of raising wages for ordinary people, which I think is something that China can now afford to do without losing its competitive position in the world economy, which really has been the engine of its development until this point, but also of investing in public goods. And that means not just infrastructure, but all the things that make life worth living for people. The Chinese population is, of course, very concerned about the improvement of environmental conditions, and rightly so. But they can also very reasonably demand that there should be more investment in better schools, in healthcare, in parks, etc., so as to gain some of the fruits of all of the economic growth and development that has taken place in a much more broad-based way. And the good thing is that for China, this is a win-win. This is also a way of increasing the consumption orientation of the economy and moving it away from the overhang of investment and from the reliance on exports.
During my time as a journalist, I've heard the echoes of the importance of healthcare, specifically in China. And there's a great division, right? Because you have the public healthcare system, and then you have this sort of semi-private healthcare system, and then you have a bunch of things kind of in between. If you were to advise them on how to address this issue on healthcare, and it's so broad, where do you begin?
It's a great question. Some years ago, I did a study of life expectancy and other measures of healthcare in China, and one of the things we found was that although they continued to improve after the economic reforms began in China, they did so at a rather slower rate than prior to that. And the reason was that prior to that, there were efforts such as the barefoot doctors and so many other things that really improved the health of China's population tremendously. And after that, there was a long period where the health system was neglected. Happily, since 2003-04, the Chinese government has been paying attention to restoring access to the health system. But I think a lot more needs to be done to ensure that it's truly universal and that it's possible for people to have access to healthcare at a sufficiently high level.
You insinuated this a little earlier about the rise out of poverty. And a lot of people are also looking at the fact that a lot of people are going from the working class into the middle class. I mean, China has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, middle classes in the world. So let me start with this. What is your definition of the middle class specifically for China? And two, there's a byproduct of that issue as well, of that success, I should say, is that when you reach the middle class, you want more. As you said, you want better healthcare, better schools, better living conditions, better air, etc. How do we balance all those factors together?
Great question. Well, of course, there are many definitions of the middle class, especially in the global context. And what people consider to be middle class in the United States or in Europe is achieved by very, very few people in developing countries. Whereas a lot of the estimates of the middle class really take pretty low standards, $5 per day, $10 per day, levels which would really not suffice in the advanced countries to classify somebody as middle class. Now, I think in China, one of the extraordinary historical achievements, as we've already discussed, is that poverty has been really reduced tremendously, if by that we mean some of the most serious absolute deprivations that people suffer from. But that having been said, the vast majority of the Chinese population is still in a relatively low bracket as concerns consumption and purchasing power. So there's a lot of room to improve that. But as I've also signaled earlier, it's not just a question of raising private incomes, but of improving the quality of the everyday life experience and of public goods. And I think there, questions of security, which you also alluded to earlier, whether one can sustain a certain level of income and also the non-material dimensions of living standards become